Hey everybody, it's Abishur Prakash, aka Mr. Geopolitics. Next week, US President Donald Trump will be meeting with his Russian counterpart, Russian President Vladimir Putin, in Alaska. This is the most pivotal event of the Ukraine war since Russia invaded more than 3 years ago. And it's being seen as a critical juncture. If the war is paused, if a ceasefire is implemented somehow, then the old status quo, many hope, can return. If, however, this meeting results in no real breakthrough, then it's a sign that even if the two heads of state meet, little can be achieved. Now, the idea and the likelihood and the probability of a breakthrough of the Ukraine war ending is quite slim, largely because Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky hasn't been invited and he's refused to give up Ukrainian land that Russia now occupies. This was, by Trump, one of the pivotal parts of the meeting with Putin, where Russia could control and walk away with territory, and Ukraine accepts this. This is not on the table. Now, this is where the story ends in most analysis. But there is a bigger picture here, which is that even as the Ukraine-Russia war enters uncharted territory, the US and Russia are dancing differently. A new geoeconomics is taking place. These two nations are competing for power, regional and global power, very similar to how they used to during the Cold War. So the Ukraine-Russia war is taking place in a backdrop where the US and Russia are dancing very differently, and in many ways, based on especially the decisions that President Trump has been making since he re-entered office in January of this year, the US is breaking Russia's footprint. This is a radical, profound statement, but I will go into detail why I'm saying this. The events and the deals and the geopolitics that America is unleashing fundamentally change Russia's role, Russia's power, Russia's ability to call the shots in many ways. So once again, the Ukraine-Russia war is not the end of the line. Even if it's resolved, the United States and Russia are locked in a new kind of geoeconomic competition that is and will continue to define the world. So why is Trump and how is Trump breaking Russia's footprint? There are several ways that this is happening. The most recent way is between Armenia and Azerbaijan. These are two nations that have been locked in a war for several years. These are two nations that have been at loggerheads for several different reasons, including demographics. And this is a war that ended some time ago, but through the United States has resulted in a semi-permanent ceasefire return of stability. Now, this has been brokered by the United States, not because of or for charity, but the United States has done two things. First, the US has gained control, the development rights, over a strategic corridor that links Azerbaijan proper with a smaller enclave, which then connects to Turkey. So this is a new economic corridor that connects Asia and Europe via Turkey, via Central Asia. And this is a corridor that will now be developed and largely protected and secured by the United States. Now, what does this mean? This means that the US now controls territory in the Caucasus. This hasn't happened before. This is a new American footprint right in Russia's backyard, right in Iran's backyard. Now, Russia has welcomed the ceasefire between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Iran has rejected the corridor that America controls now, that America is going to now develop and use for geoeconomic reasons. Second is that for long-term stability and peace, both Armenia and Azerbaijan turned to America. They went thousands of kilometers away. They did not turn to Russia. They didn't turn to any of their regional neighbors. They went to the United States. Now, specifically for Armenia, which has been locking horns with Russia since it went to war with Azerbaijan, asked Russia for support, but because of Russia's exposure in the Ukraine war, because of Russia's delegation of resources to Ukrainian battle lines, Russia did not send aid that satisfied Armenia. So Armenia has been redefining its relationship with the Russian defense bloc, CSTO. Armenia has been entertaining a range of new setups with the EU, and now to broker a long-term ceasefire, to define the future of the region, Armenia has turned to America. So in two key ways, just when it comes to Armenia and Azerbaijan, when it comes to actual territory, and when it comes to who these nations are looking to lead them, America has broken Russia's footprint. Second has to do with energy exports. Now, 70% of Russia's energy exports go to China and India. These are not just the two main export markets for Russia. These are Russia's two most significant, most critical alliances in the world, even if the Kremlin refuses to label its relationship with Beijing or New Delhi as an alliance. These are relationships that underpin the Russian economy. But at the same time, Russia is still reliant on energy exports to Europe and wants to diversify its energy export model beyond India and China. However, Trump's move with the European Union to lock in, to integrate the European purchases of American LNG as part of the broader trade deal puts Russia in a very awkward situation. Now, of course, there is big what ifs as to whether the US-EU trade deal has longevity, whether it's sustainable. Many European leaders have poured cold water on the deal. There's a lot of doubt as to whether the conditions and the targets set in the deal can actually be met. But even if the deal still has ways to go in terms of negotiation and finding a middle point that both sides can actually reach, the idea that the European Union would buy $750 billion of LNG from America reflects the new model that America is going to replicate around the world. That the US is on the precipice of taking its LNG exports to another level. And this is going to largely focus on the Indo-Pacific, on markets like Japan, like South Korea, like Southeast Asia, potentially even parts of Africa. So America is about to collide with Russia when it comes to LNG exports. And because America's economy is so many times larger than Russia's, America's influence and power eclipses that of Russia's, America could have its way in a way that blocks Russia out. America can leverage its economy, threaten tariffs, threaten security guarantees, threaten foreign investment, take other measures like around chips or AI that makes other countries dance to America's tune. And in this case, that means buying American LNG and in the process, phasing out purchases from Russia. So Russia is in a very unexpected position when it comes to its energy exports because it's surviving over 20,000 sanctions. It's surviving after losing the West, the EU, other Western markets that it was exporting to that are now seeking a different energy matrix. The Russians have maintained their economic stability by largely turning to China and India and other export markets around the world and by trading through their shadow fleet. But this is not the end of the road for Russia. This is simply a question of surviving in the short term. Russia needs to find new avenues to export its energy, but it's moving into those avenues at a moment when America is seeking to unleash its LNG exports across the world. And within all that, of course, for the US is a question of pricing. US LNG exports tend to be multiple times more expensive than the Russian LNG, but that's where American tariffs, American security guarantees, America threatening to withhold the export of technology could come into play. The third area where Trump and America are breaking Russia's footprint has to do with the deals that America is signing from the DRC to Ukraine. America is signing ceasefire and is attempting diplomatic deals that are in tandem also giving the US access to critical resources like rare earths in Ukraine. Now, this is very much a gray area because this is very old geopolitics, but it's taking place in a very new way. And there is the analysis so far is limited to America needs to cut its reliance on China for critical metals. America needs to achieve sovereignty and self-reliance when it comes to certain resource supply chains. But there's another angle to this, which is that if America gains the mining rights over the next 2 to 5 to 10 years, can develop these projects in Ukraine, in the DRC, in other places where America is able to gain a foothold, then America will not just be able to achieve a certain self-reliance, build a certain stockpile and reserve of critical metals, but America may begin to export them. And this takes on not just China, but Russia. Critical metals have been one of the few trade corridors that the West has refused to sanction when it comes to Russia. The European Union has purchased over 12 to 13 billion euros of critical metals from Russia since the Ukraine war began. The West has refused to stop purchasing these goods, largely because there's no alternative. But if America becomes the new exporter of certain types of critical metals, then it will begin to take on Russia in a new way. So in two key commodity arenas, LNG and critical metals, America is gaining ground. And this will challenge the Russian footprint and the Russian foothold over these areas like never before. And lastly, has to do with the secondary sanctions that Trump has threatened on India and China. And this is something I've discussed in terms of the US-India relationship. I recommend you check that video out. But the US secondary sanctions, the idea of 100% tariff on the Chinese economy, on the Indian economy, on the Brazilian economy, on the Turkish economy, on any nation that trades with Russia. And if that's not enough, then potentially agreeing to what Lindsey Graham proposed in the US, which is a 500% tariff on nations buying Russian energy. Even if this is not imposed because Washington and Moscow come to some kind of agreement and the secondary tariffs, secondary sanctions naturally disappear, it's an alarm bell. It's an alarm bell for the Chinese, for the Indians, and for many other economies around the world that their reliance on the Russian energy model machine is not sustainable. It's not safe. And that at any moment they could face excruciating tariffs. And even if they feel they can fight these tariffs and they can battle America, it's a question of if they want to. Is it worth colliding with America in order to continue buying Russian energy? Or should these governments begin plotting a 5, 10, 15, 20-year roadmap that distances and decouples them from Russian energy? This is the door that has swung open. It was already creaking open with the Western sanctions on Russia. Now it has swung open because of this secondary sanctions threat. Current economies that are buying Russian energy and future economies that are thinking about buying Russian energy all of them have to think differently. And for Russia, this creates a new crisis, which is how does it convince other nations to continue buying its goods if such a threat looms over them, which can be activated at any second. So these are several ways that Trump is breaking Russia's footprint. Some of them are taking place in real time, like with Armenia and Azerbaijan. Others are very much long-term and will materialize over the next 2 to 5 to 10 years. So there's still ways to go regarding America moving in a certain direction and whether Russians can calibrate and update and modify their geostrategy for what America is doing. So what does this mean for Russia exactly? Well, it means several things at once. First of all, it means that Russia has to increasingly depend on non-energy sectors. This is a trajectory that the Saudis are mastering, the Emiratis are mastering. Many other energy exporters are trying to shift their economy away from being dependent on energy exports. Russia is now forced onto the same path, and this will make Russia more reliant on AI, on quantum, on robotics, but specifically on nuclear energy. This is a sector, a field, a battlefield that Russia has been doubling down on, not just in Asia, for example, with Bangladesh, but also in parts of Africa where Russia is exploring a range of nuclear setups to help nations achieve their own goals, especially in West Africa. So Russians are likely to double down on building out nuclear energy infrastructure across the world. So this era of nuclear energy becomes a new geopolitical battlefield. Second is that the Russians have to depend on a future where we have to think about a future where China cannot be the single most important nation for it. The Russians are very skeptical about moving too deep into the Chinese orbit, moving too close to China, and effectively losing sovereignty and control over their own economy and sphere of influence. The Chinese have made huge gains in Central Asia and have made a range of provocative statements, including in Kazakhstan, calling for sovereignty that would make the Russians a little bit uncomfortable. So now Russia is looking for new ways to balance itself out. And this makes India pivotal to Russia's future. So while all eyes are on the Sino-Russian relationship, or what some term an alliance, what some label as an alliance, another equally significant relationship or alliance will be the Russia-India relationship. This is a relationship that Russia is going to lean on more and more, especially as India's defense budget continues to rise, especially as India's middle class continues to grow, especially as India continues to harbor one of the largest labor forces that are young, where 40 to 50% of the country is under the age of 35. Russia is going to depend on this relationship, not just for its companies, for its exports, for its consumer goods, but to offset the relationship with China. So I've gone through how Trump is breaking Russia's footprint. We've talked about how Russia has to maneuver, two ways Russia has to maneuver. In reality, for the West, a different Russia is forming. The West has experience with two types of Russia. The first was after World War II, where the Soviet Union became the single biggest adversary for the United States, for the West, the chief adversary from military to ideology. And second is post-Cold War Russia, where it seemed that Russia was moving into the global Western systems, was becoming part of the global order. Now, the tables have been completely inverted. The Russians are not the chief adversary of the West anymore, and Russia is no longer in the global order the way it once was. In fact, Russia is turning away from the established systems and structures and is seeking deeper links with the global south and the alternative structures and orders that are forming. So this is a new experience, a new phase with an old adversary from the Western perspective. The West can't treat this as the same old as a new Cold War, as some put it, which is an incredibly shallow way and limited way of looking at what's taking place, not just between the US and Russia, but also between the US and China. This is a new kind of fight, heavily centered on geoeconomics, heavily centered on America reinventing what it does in the world, doing things that it wasn't doing before or hasn't done in a long time, like starting to export critical metals again. America led this industry in the 60s, in the 70s, but this then fell off a cliff as China gained the upper hand. So both the United States and Russia are moving in ways that they haven't moved in a long time or ever before. But for Russia especially, America is making moves, America is taking steps that challenge the Russian footprint, that challenge the Russian geostrategy, that challenge the pillars that Russia's economy stands on. And the idea that if a ceasefire is brokered between Russia and Ukraine, that this competition ends, this strategic competition ends, is a pipe dream. This is yet another geopolitical flashpoint that has begun, and it makes the world even more fluid, it makes deals even more transient, and it takes volatility to even higher levels. I hope you resonated with this video. Leave your comments below and talk soon.